Welcome to your next video. This video is on issues of basic pitch. What we're going to talk about in this video is the staff, clefs, the difference between steps, skips, and leaps, and also how to figure out pitch names for various clefs. So we'll start by talking about the staff. Right now what you see is a staff. You see 5 lines. You see many staves, actually. Staves is the plural of staff. So if I'm just going to work with the first staff here, the top staff, it's very basic. 5 lines and then spaces in between the lines. Each of those lines and spaces will represent a different note. But there's really no way for me to know right now what note any of these are, because all I have is just a staff. I need something that indicates what lines and spaces represent which notes. So what that is, the thing that does that is a clef. So I'm going to draw some different clefs and show you what I mean by this. So the first clef I'm going to draw is the treble clef. That didn't work very well. Let's try this. Okay. So you'll see that I started at the bottom, went straight up, did a loop around to the right, and crossed over back to the left, and then back to the right again, and it makes this treble clef. What you'll probably want to do is get some staff paper and try drawing some of these. You will need to know how to draw these for your exams. So make sure that you know how to do it, relatively neat, and it works best if you start at the bottom and go up and just kind of make it in one smooth motion. So go ahead and practice some of those now. Now the treble clef, a couple of important things about it. It's very important that this kind of loopy part here, the small loop in the middle, that's centered around this second line from the bottom. Sometimes the treble clef is called a G clef. It looks a little bit like a G, actually. And the line that goes through the center of it right here, this is G, the note. So this can help you remember, if you remember that the treble clef looks like a G and that the line that goes through the middle of the loop is the line for G. So the second from the bottom line is not always a G. It's only a G if you're using a treble clef. But because we have so many notes that are possible, if you think about a piano and how many keys are on a piano, or you think about how many possible notes there are to play on a guitar or a clarinet, or how many possible notes to sing, even just in one person's voice, let alone like someone with a very low voice to someone with a middle voice to someone with a very high voice, there are lots of possible notes, way more than are represented by just these lines and spaces. So clefs help give us kind of a more specific, the specific note. So we'll talk about that later, but for now know that this G that runs through the middle of the treble clef is a very specific G. It's not just any G, but it's one particular one. So a line and a space each represent one note in the sequence. And for music, we always name notes by letters. We start with A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then we start over again with A. We don't go anywhere past G, and the next note after G is A. So if I'm looking at this line being G, that means the next line higher, the next line or space higher is going to be an A. So this space here is an A. If I draw a note on this space, I drew a half note on A. So now if I saw that and I was playing the piano, I would know to play A for the duration of a half note. If I go up another line, that's B, then the next space is C, the next space is D, and so on. And I could also do it going down. If I start with G here, I go down to F in this space, to E on this line, to D on this space. So that's how pitches work in conjunction with clefs. Now, you could sit here and figure out every note every time you ever saw a note, but it's actually really hard to do that. It takes forever, and that's not actually what it means to be able to read pitch. That's being able to figure out pitch, but it's not quite the same. And what we need as musicians, we need to be able to read quickly, and we need to have facility with this reading. So if you are not already familiar with the treble clef, you'll want to be able to know right away if I draw a quarter note on this line, you would need to immediately know that that is E. If you didn't immediately know that that's E, then that's something that you'll have to memorize. So there are some quick ways that you can help yourself memorize these things. You can come up with an acronym for the lines or the spaces. For this one, the spaces, if you start with the bottom space here, and you think about these 4 spaces, they spell the word face, F-A-C-E. So that's one way that you can remember the spaces. So I recommend that you think about that. If you want an acronym for the lines, you have E, G, B, D, F. And I guarantee you, if you Google this, you'll find some pretty amazing acronyms. Or you can make up your own. That's also kind of fun. However works best for you is what you should do. But you do need to memorize the pitches on the treble clef so that I could give you a pitch and you would instantly know what pitch it is. So eventually I will probably give you a quiz that is timed that you'll need to be able to know immediately what the pitches are. And that's just to ensure that you are able to read them quickly, because if you have to stop and think about what pitch you're looking at every time you see a pitch, everything else in this class and every other music class you ever take will be really, really difficult. So it's important to know what these are right away. So go ahead and start memorizing them now if you don't already have them memorized. I guarantee you, you will be glad that you did that later on. Okay, so this is the treble clef. Okay, let's talk about another clef. This is a very common clef. The treble clef and this clef are the 2 most common clefs that you will see. So I'm going to use the next staff down, and I'm going to draw a bass clef. The bass clef starts with a little circle on this line, the second line from the top, and kind of curves around like this. And then there are always 2 dots right to the right of the curvy part. These 2 dots are on either side of the line that goes through the first dot I made. This is sometimes called the F clef. It doesn't really look like an F, but in its historical shape, at some points throughout history, it kind of changed shapes, but it kind of at first looked like an F, so that's kind of where it gets its name. And guess what? This line that goes through the middle of the dots and then through this bigger dot is the pitch F. So if you remember that the bass clef, bass, B-A-S-S, as in like the instrument bass or the voice part bass, not like bass like the foundation of something, not that kind of bass. So when we talk about bass clef, you can remember that it's an F clef, and the line that goes through the middle is an F. So the same thing with the letters applies. If I go up to a space above that, it's G, the line above that is A, the space above that is B. So if I drew a half note on this line, we could figure out that I have F here, I go down 1 to the space is E, I go down 1 to the next line, that's D. So this would be a half note on D. You might notice that this half note looks bigger than this half note. That's probably not good. That means I'm being a little bit sloppy. So if I was doing this in pencil like I should be, then I would probably want to erase this and make it a little bit smaller. But when I write this note on this space, when I write the note on this line, I'm making sure that I don't take up too much space on either side. See how my note head doesn't touch either of the other lines that are around it? That's on purpose so that you can clearly see that I mean to indicate this line here, this D. Same thing with my note in the space. I very carefully only contained it within the space so that it didn't overlap any other notes. So there's no question that what I meant to indicate was this space here. So just a little bit about notation. Make sure you're very careful. If I receive homework and I can't tell what note you mean, then I'm not able to properly grade it, and that makes me sad because I want to give you points for what you know, but I can't do that if it's too sloppy. So you'll want to come up with ways to remember the bass clef as well, again, if you don't already have it memorized. So you can think of the spaces. We have A, C, E, G for the spaces, and for the lines we have G, B, D, F, A. And again, you can use whatever you want for that. If you're having trouble finding an acronym or remembering something, shoot me a quick email and I'll give you some suggestions. But I think it's kind of more fun to figure out one on your own. It helps you remember it better because it's one that you think is cool. So I'll go ahead and let you do that. So the treble clef and the bass clef are the two most basic clefs that you will need to know, and you'll need to be able to know what the spaces and the lines are. So again, if I give you a note, you would immediately know what letter name goes with that note. Okay, one other thing in this lesson. It is good to know that there are other types of clefs. These are just the two most common. And I will teach you about some other clefs probably a little bit later in the semester. But right now we're just going to stick with these two. I think that's probably enough for you to think about and figure out on your own. But the one other thing I wanted to talk about is, since we have these lines and spaces and these letter names, there are some other terms that I want you to know about. So these terms have to do with the relationship of pitches to each other. So just for kicks, let's use a treble clef, but it doesn't really matter. This would apply to any clef. So when we have two notes together, we call those, we say that there's a step between those notes if the notes are on adjacent lines or spaces. So here we have an A and then we have a B. So the letter names are adjacent, but also the notes themselves are adjacent from one space up to the very next line. We call this a step. If we have a note and then the second note doesn't go to the next one but skips over that line and goes to the next space, we call that a skip. So you'll see that there's only one letter name missing. There's A, then we don't have a B, and then there's C. So they're still very close together, but there's a note that's skipped, so we call it a skip. If we skip more than one note, we call it a leap. So there's a bigger distance between these two pitches, and we would call this a leap. Anything that is not a step or a skip will end up being a leap. All of these have been ascending. They've gone up. So these are ascending steps, skips, and leaps. But I could also go down. That's a descending step. That's a descending skip. Notice how I skipped the space. So I have just two lines. And then this. That's a descending leap. These aren't the same size, actually. If I were to count how many notes were included in this. If I started here, I'd go A, B, C, D, E. That's 5. But if I start here, B, A, G, F, E, D, that's 6. So these are not the same size leaps, but they're both considered leaps because they're bigger than a skip. All right, I hope that you enjoyed this lesson. Make sure that you memorize those the letter names for the treble and the bass clefs, and that will come in very handy. You don't have any assignments due this Wednesday, but you will have some due next week, so make sure that you start getting ready for that. And if you have any questions, go ahead and shoot me an email, and I will talk to you later.